Welcome to Arabiya English. We have with us today best-selling British author Anthony Horowitz. Thank you for your time, Anthony. I hope you are having a great time in Dubai. Let me start with the prequel to the James Bond series. That catches a lot of people's imagination all around the world. What prompted you to take this up, and where exactly are you on the curve?
Well, I wrote my first James Bond novel, Trigger Mortis, 3 years ago, and that came about because the estate asked me to do it. I've always, throughout my life, been a great admirer of Ian Fleming and James Bond. My own books, the Alex Rider series, were largely inspired by them, by his work. And so when they invited me to write Trigger Mortis, I was absolutely thrilled and excited, and I wrote it, and it did quite well. People liked it. And I was very surprised when they came back and asked me to do a second one, although I was absolutely delighted because, of course, I'm the first writer to have managed to do two. And I think they've merely decided that actually it's probably easier to stick with the same writer rather than to keep changing after every book. And Forever and a Day comes out in a couple of months' time from now, and I wish I could talk about it at length, but until today I wasn't even allowed to talk about the title. I mean, so it's the first time I've actually even spoken the title on camera. But as you said, it takes place, I think, before Casino Royale, 3 months before Casino Royale starts. It's an adventure, and it looks, I suppose, at what makes Bond Bond.
The technology that we are swamped with today, that's changing reading habits all over the world. As an author, how big a challenge is it for you to keep your grab on the audience, so to say?
Well, it depends what you mean by the new technology. Are you talking about e-readers and that sort of thing? Because that only helps writers like me. The very fact that my book can be in anybody's pocket anywhere in the world in 10 seconds is, of course, fantastic. Now, speaking as somebody of the age I am, I personally prefer paper and old-fashioned books that can sit on a shelf and remind me of all the great books that I've been reading. But actually, the new technology is not something to fear, it's something to embrace.
Right. But choosing a subject, has it evolved over the years? Was it very different when you started off as a writer, and now the subject just gets into your lap and you get on with the writing bit?
I don't think that very much has changed in my life from the day I started writing. I mean, I'm still doing what I always did, which is sitting in a room, okay, because I'm successful, the room is a bit bigger than it used to be, but I'm still sitting at my desk thinking up ideas and writing. For what it's worth, I use an old-fashioned fountain pen for my first draft because I love the scratch of the nib, I love the flow of ink, I love the feel of paper. I'm an old-fashioned sort of person. And of course, I've got the internet now to give me instant access to research materials and to connect with people, to ask questions, to get books downloaded, whatever. So technology and the changing world does make a difference, I suppose, to some aspects of the way I write. But fundamentally what I'm doing, I think, is the same. And maybe that's one of the reasons why my books have tended to last, because they're not of the moment, as it were. They're not sort of taking advantage. So I'm not, for example, now writing about, I don't know, something to do with bitcoins or something, because who knows in 2 years' time if bitcoins will even exist.
Right. But then who's your typical audience? When you're writing, what kind of reader you keep in mind? Is it a teenager? Is it a 60-year-old man?
It depends on the book I'm writing, of course, but generally speaking, I don't think too much about my audience. My kids' books began because I was writing for my 14-year-old self. I was writing for the child I'd once been. And that memory of childhood, which incidentally I think never changes, no matter how much the world changes, no matter how much new technology there is, the very physicality, the essence of childhood remains the same. Children are still excited, for example, by somebody falling over, will still make them laugh, like it did 200 years ago. And being chased by people with guns or with arrows or whatever still sets off the same sort of elements of fear as it did 500 years ago. So some things don't change. When I write a book, I am writing pure story, and I think story isn't for a specific audience, it's for everyone.
When you come to this part of the world, and this is of course a very peaceful and happening part of the world, but the entire region is not peaceful. So do you look at these conflicts as raw material for your books at some stage? Does it provide background in certain cases?
I think that when I'm writing the Alex Rider books, although I am writing about the real world, and I write about conflict in the world, and I write about politics to a certain extent, and power and inhumanity and evil, my books are broadly speaking, an escape from all those things. So although I draw on the real world, and there's not a single Alex Rider story that isn't based on something I've read in the newspapers, broadly speaking, I'm not trying to rub my reader's face in how dangerous and how difficult the world has become. I'm trying to offer them solace and sanctuary.
James Bond is very typically British in many ways, but Britain has also changed over the years, a colonial power which sits at the heart of change that's happening across Europe and the developed world. How do you look at countries' transformation? For instance, a country in the West, the transformation is different from countries in the East, for instance. Do countries appear as characters to you or as background material?
It's a very interesting and complicated question you've just put to me, and in fact there are two ways to answer it. The first is, in literature, in my books, has England, my country, changed, and how do I view the world in my books? And in my life, reading the newspapers and being British and seeing what is happening to my country at the moment, how do I respond to that? They're two quite separate things. And so I'll answer them briefly in both cases. In my books, I think not much has changed. I've been writing for 30 years, and I think that if you look at the Britain of my books then and now, it's pretty much the same. And I try to paint an optimistic, glowing picture of both my country and of the world, especially if I'm writing for young people, because if you're writing for young people, you've got to have an optimistic point of view. You've got to believe in the best. It's their world, and you can't give them all the problems and the baggage. You've got to give them a view of the world that makes them inspired to make it better. If you were asking me about my country and the world as I see it, just simply as somebody of my age, I have concerns. It seems to me that we've moved into a time now of great difficulty and unhappiness and uncertainty. And certainly Britain at the moment, as it continues to debate Brexit, is a very divided country, and there does seem to be a great deal of animosity that I hadn't noticed 10 years ago. But as a writer, my response to that is still to believe in the best, to say that this is just a phase we're going through and that things will get better.
Right. So when you look at the rise of Trump in the West and the rise of Duterte in the East, is it lack of choice or is it anti-intellectualism at one level? How do you look at these political changes, even if it is driven by a personality?
I would have said that Trump and Brexit have the same origins, which is a lack of faith in politics, in the political system, in capitalism even. And so there is a determination to change things and to change them dramatically. Now you cannot have two more dramatic changes, and I'm not saying that they're changes for good or for bad, in both President Trump and in Brexit. And it's very interesting that with the superpowers changing, with China bursting through, with India emerging as a major trading country, the world is transforming in front of our eyes. And I think that is bringing with it a great deal of insecurity and uncertainty and fear, which is finding a manifestation in the way people are now voting and in the way people are acting.
How do you view the non-English writing that exists today? Do you get the time to read translations of, say, Arabic or Portuguese or Chinese writers?
I'm afraid not. I'm afraid to say, and it does shame me to admit it, that there are so many hundreds of books for me to read. In my case, sitting behind me now is an 800-page book on the life of President Truman, which I'm reading simply for research for a television program, and that's before I get to the book which I want to read for pleasure, which happens to be a Sarah Waters novel, a writer I particularly like, whose books I haven't read. My time is so limited, this is a bad excuse, but it is the truth, that I don't have the freedom to read as much as I would and should. But the fact that I read so little work in translation is shameful.
I want to understand from you your approach to writing when it comes to television, for instance, and other forms that you have explored so far? Is it fundamentally different? You have to reorient yourself, unlearn what you have learned in the last book experience?
Writing television, theatre, articles for newspapers, and writing books are different disciplines, but they are united by the same aim, which is to tell stories, to engage, to explore character, to entertain. I mean, at the end of the day, don't forget, your questions suggest you're talking to somebody who is a more serious writer perhaps than I am. At the end of the day, I know what my books do and what my books are, which are their entertainments, they entertain and such. So your questions have to a certain extent made me a little nervous because I'm not sure that I really have good enough answers for them. I'm doing my best, but now I've forgotten what you even asked me.
I'll give you a very simple one. What's a typical day in the life of Anthony Horowitz?
I try to make every day untypical. I try not to have a day that begins at 8 o'clock in the morning and has writing until lunchtime, walking the dog in the afternoon, waiting for my children to come up and say hello to me, seeing my wife going out for dinner, going to the cinema, going to bed. That was a typical day, by the way. I try to vary it. I travel a lot. I'm very lucky. I get invited to places like Dubai, to festivals. I meet people like you who get me thinking about the world and about things. I'm always working on different books. That means research, travel, meeting people, reading. I spend an awful lot of time at a desk with a piece of paper in front of me. But when I'm not at that desk, that piece of paper, I do try to vary things.
How do you look at the youth, bulging youth population in these parts of the world? Do you see them as your readers who would read and get influenced by what you write?
I will say only this. When you meet young people from different cultures, what always impresses me is how much they have in common, how close they are. I mean, when I see people from other countries and other cultures, do I see different colors? Do I see different accents, different attitudes? Well, yes, to an extent. But what I find encouraging is that I find this commonality. Now, maybe it's because most of the people I meet through literature and books bring people together. Why am I here in Dubai now? Why am I talking to you? Because I believe that story and narrative and character and books are what unite us and bring us together, and that's why we celebrate them in a festival like this. So, the simple answer to your question is that I see people who are brought together by their youth and by their love of books and by their innate goodness. And I see that much more than in what divides people and puts us at each other's throats.
It was lovely talking to you.
Were the answers anyway reasonable?